Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Alex Cooley. I'm the director of the Harriman Institute, which is the Regional Studies Institute here at Columbia University dedicated to Russia, Eurasian, East European studies, and the Balkans, of course. Today's conference is an example of how Harriman supports research by sponsoring multidisciplinary events involving questions of international relations, war and peace, human rights law, and journalism. And I am absolutely delighted to introduce Ms. Madeline Rees, our distinguished keynote speaker this evening, who embodies, I would say, Harriman's commitment both to interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary work and global impact, not only in the region, but beyond. Madeline Rees became the Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in 2010. She began life as a lawyer in 1990 and within 4 years was made partner in a large UK law firm specialized in discrimination law. She also worked on behalf of both the Commission for Racial Equality and the Equal Opportunities Commission, mainly on developing strategies to establish rights under domestic law. Extending her skills to the international sphere, Madeline brought cases to the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court in Luxembourg and was recognized as one of the leading lawyers in the field of discrimination in the Chamber's Directory of British Lawyers. In 1998, Madeline began work for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights as the gender expert and head of office in post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina. Her arrival to Sarajevo marked the first, if not only, presence among hundreds of international experts whose mandate was to advance the human rights of Bosnian women, particularly for those women who had endured a violent, catastrophic ethnic war that had targeted women's bodies with unparalleled sexual violence. This was an immense undertaking to address the needs of a population that had survived horrific crimes while working in an exceptionally challenging political environment that was shaped principally by international mandates. Madeline became a force to be reckoned with as she possessed the unique capacity to understand the complexity of pursuing human rights within the political constraints of the Dayton Peace Agreement landscape, along within the constraints of the UN and her office as well. In that role, Madeline made a foundational contribution to our understanding of the distinct challenges faced by women in post-conflict settings worldwide. She served as a transformative example of how gender issues should be approached post-conflict. Her observations as to the importance of building gender and women into peace agreement texts, given the difficulty of mobilizing international support for women's rights in peace agreement implementation contexts, serve as a valuable advice for mediators in later conflicts and is now the standard position of the United Nations. Madeline also broke new ground in supporting extensive work on the issue of trafficking of women. Madeline's advocacy also played a central role in how sexual violence and conflict has been approached in international criminal trials, whereas cases from Bosnia produced some of the first jurisprudence in the area. She also played a key role in speaking out against human rights abuses and sexual violence by peacekeepers and others working for the United Nations. In 2001, she exposed the widespread trafficking and sexual abuse of women and girls and the subsequent cover-up by the UN authorities, together with UN police investigator Catherine Bolkovac. It became public when Madeline asked Tanya Domi, then a Columbia graduate student and now our professor within the Harriman Institute and head of Balkan Studies programming here. Thank you, Tanya, once again. Broke the story in a Bosnian daily that exposed the crimes and the cover-up that included the highest officials of the UN missions to Bosnia. These events were dramatized in the 2012 film The Whistleblower, with Madeline portrayed by Vanessa Redgrave. The film brought worldwide attention to the burgeoning crime of human trafficking and was screened in UN missions and was mandatory viewing by all USAID employees. Madeline was a member of the expert coordination group of the Trafficking Task Force of the Stability Pact, which was then known as the Alliance Against Trafficking. And the revelations and subsequent suggestions for reform sparked changes in international law and UN policy. From September 2006 to April 2010, Madeline Rees served as the head of the Women's Rights and Gender Unit for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, and her work involved describing and outlining how men and women can experience events differently, particularly in post-conflict situations. Since 2010, Madeline has been Secretary General of the WILPF, the world's oldest women's peace and disarmament organization, which works for peace by nonviolent means and promotes political, economic, and social justice for all. In 2014, Madeline's work to end the use of rape as a weapon of war was recognized by Queen Elizabeth when she was awarded an Order of the British Empire Medal. During Madeline's time already as Secretary General of WILPF, she has played another transformative role, renewing the organization as a major global force for women's rights in conflict and post-conflict settings. The organization has become the key transnational drivers for the implementation of gender equality and transformative approaches to conflict resolution in the world today. Fundamental transformation really has been at the heart of all of Madeleine's activities, and has been characterized as brave, difficult, and extremely effective in her passion, dedication, and her effective leadership role. For all these reasons, University of Edinburgh awarded Madeleine an honorary degree of Doctor of Science in Social Science in 2015, and she is also visiting professor of practice at the London School of Economics Center for Women, Peace and Security. She is also our distinguished keynote speaker here. Please join me in welcoming her.
My goodness, what a fantastic introduction. Did my mum write that? No, thank you. That really was extremely nice, and thank you, Tanya, for having invited me to speak. The only thing about having a really fantastic introduction like that is now you're going to expect me to say something decent. So I will attempt to cover what is a very, very difficult subject. And just to say, I think that the documentary that was shown just before the break really epitomizes so many of the things that I'm going to reference in my talk this evening. What I want to try and cover in the title of the talk, I question whether rape is in fact, rape in conflict is inevitable or whether it's constructed. And in addressing that, I think it's important for us to locate, first of all, how and in what way societies, both in terms of culture and social relations, both contribute to and impact upon how we would deal with issues particularly pertinent to the issue of rape and sexual violence in conflict. So I want to look at law and how what its relationship is to that social cultural context. I want to look at the reality of the impact of law and how its interpretation works in relation to the survivors and those who come to testify. And I want to look at men. And I want to look at men both as victims, but also as perpetrators, but also as part of systems, and the relationship between, again, culture and societal norms, law, its impact and effect on those who testify, and then how that works into constructs of masculinity and what we need to do in order to position ourselves so as to address all of those things and to do it in less than 30 minutes. So, to start with, I think we know that as a matter of law, rape was not dealt with effectively or practically. As the gentleman asked a question in the last session, rape has always been a part of war. It has always been an inevitable part of war. Rape and pillage were synonymous with Vikings. And it was not until the early 19th century, early 20th century, sorry, when we had rape actually put forward as a crime against the dignity of persons, but particularly of women, and seen much more as ownership property rather than as a rights violation and a crime in and of itself. Military tribunals did delict rape as a war crime, but didn't actually say what it was. It didn't actually describe what rape was. So we actually start off in a framework which is socially and culturally reflective, or I should say a law which is socially and culturally reflective of the position of women within societies. Women were primarily the marriage options for men and property of the men, and everything devolved in terms of their rights from their status as a married woman or as a potentially married woman. So hence the property rights, the honor of the family being impugned completely in any sort of activity or sexual activity around them. That changed dramatically as a result of what happened in Bosnia and Rwanda. And one of the biggest and I think most important elements was the arrival of feminist lawyers, like Patty Sellers, like Christine Chinkin, like Kelly Askin, who made an incredible and determined effort to have international law recognize what was really happening in relation to sexualized violence in conflict. So we built up, or a body of law was built up, which has had this transformative effect. And this we must celebrate, because it is vitally important that we have a jurisprudence which is reflective of the experiences of women. It started to a certain extent in the decision of Akayuzu in the ICTR, which was the tribunal for Rwanda. And in that one you may recall that the judge, in that case a woman, realized that in fact that she wasn't hearing what was being said by the women, because the prosecutor hadn't put it into the indictment. What women were saying and what had gone into the indictment were very different. And in fact, she understood that when they said he took me into his tent and he married me, she was actually listening to accounts of rape and sexual violence. So she demanded that the prosecutor went away and recraft the indictment. And as a result, we had the first major case from the Rwandan tribunal on the sexual violence and rape as a war crime, and in this case, a constituent part of genocide. That in and of itself is important because it was a recognition of the social and cultural context in which it was happening, because the women who were raped could no longer be married, therefore would no longer have children who were Tutsis, therefore it was a constituent part of genocide. So we actually have law reflecting social and cultural norms, but maybe some would suggest a little unhelpfully in underscoring the fact that it was still a matter of dishonor for the women. Moving on to and back to the Balkans tribunal, the first case there was that of Ferunja, and lots of us were not too happy about the way the definition of rape was actually ascribed in that case, because it was very much one of body parts. So we were told that it was sexual penetration, however slight, of one of the orifices of the body. Well, that sounds like it's all right as a definition, but then just put yourself for a moment if you're a person who's having to testify to that. I'm going to park that with you for a moment because I'm going to revisit that afterwards. You then had further jurisprudential advances. Kunratz was the next case, in which it borrowed from Akayuzu and it borrowed from Ferunja body parts, but in circumstances which are coercive. But it did raise that awful spectre of consent. So it actually spoke to sexual penetration, however slight, but then without the consent of the victim, assessed in the context of the surrounding circumstances. Park that one, because I'm going to come back to that when I talk more about the experience of the women who testified. There were a series of other cases. I'm not going to go into them all because there are lots and lots of cases, and whilst I might find them really interesting, probably some of you will think, no, law bore. But end of the ICTY, end of the ICTR, we have got a series of cases which establish beyond any complaint now that rape in conflict is both a war crime, it's a crime against humanity, it can be prosecuted as torture, and in certain circumstances, it can also be an element of genocide. That is massive progress. So, as far as that, good. We also now have it in very specifically set out in the Statute of Rome for the International Criminal Court, and as many of you might have seen yesterday, the case of Bemba, he was effectively prosecuted for crimes of rape and sexual violence. So there is a system, it is beginning to work, it is gaining notoriety. Excellent. But, and there's always a but, I want to talk to you a bit more about what happened to the actual victims, because we do have international law, it does not exist in its vacuum. How to get to that space where all those rights were recognized in the way I've just outlined took incredible courage by the women who came to testify, incredible brilliance by the prosecutors and those who assisted them in the development of jurisprudence, but they were given by people who've been brought up in a system of non-conflict adjudication, who are reflecting on practices from non-conflict crimes of rape committed in situations which are very differently situated to those that are from conflict. So they were borrowing from a non-conflict situation to apply their thoughts and thinking and application of law to conflict situation, which is extraordinarily difficult when it comes to how you treat the women. If you think of the issue of consent, for example, I've mentioned the Ferunja case, the body parts. If you've got to prove that, you've got to question the woman as to what happened and exactly what happened, the detail. It becomes almost pornographic. How much, how little, when, how. It is extremely humiliating and degrading. And then, if you raise on top of that the issue of consent. And they weren't supposed to go into consent. Several of us had filed amicus briefs beforehand to the ICTY to say why consent should not, could not be used in this form of jurisprudence. There was always an opt-out clause, that if the circumstances seemed to provide that a defense of consent could be raised, as it was in Kunerats, then the judges were supposed to allow the defense to pursue it, and they did. So in Kunerats, we had a 16-year-old woman who had been multiply raped and was taken by her particular rapist to his commander and told to have sex with him. The commander didn't know. So the commander said he thought that she was coming on to him, in the middle of a war, and she's from the Muslim minority community in Foča. But that was his defense. And so the defense was allowed, and she was interrogated for 2 days as to the nature, what exactly she'd done, what she, where she'd been, what she'd said to him, over and over and over again. She didn't break down. She prevailed. And he was found guilty, as were the others who were complicit in the commission of the crime. 3 years later, she was again she was in Sarajevo, and she was subpoenaed by the International Court. It was a Bosnian court, but with international judges sitting on it. They subpoenaed her to come and testify again, because there was another one of the perpetrators who was actually standing trial in Bosnia. Poor woman, she absolutely could not do this. And we had an agreement with the court that they wouldn't subpoena witnesses again if they'd already testified at the court. And in fact, it turned out that the tribunal itself had said you can take, if the evidence has been taken, has been used and proven to be reliable, you do not have to do it again. But they went ahead with the subpoena on pain of the equivalent of a 15,000 euro fine or 30 days imprisonment. So you had the reality of what had happened to that woman, and then the treatment of her. So when I say fantastic decision, look what happened to her. In the end, it didn't happen because we were able to argue that there was a violation of her European Convention rights. Absolutely, that she would be treated in this way, cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. But that was the reality of how the systems could work. So the consent part, the way in which you're utilized as part of a system of prosecution rather than treated as an individual with rights, were very much a reality for those women who came forward. Many of them who did choose to testify are very, very glad that they did, because it did give closure, it did lead to the establishment of international law in the way that it has. And for that, I think all women who are in conflict situation will recognize the incredible sacrifice that was done, at least in that fora, by the women from Bosnia who came forward and subsequent. That said, the treatment of them by the court was reflective of attitudes created by societies, as I've mentioned, but then the treatment in society itself. In your film, society came together to really give that sort of tremendous support to the women in Kosovo. In Bosnia, it was very fragmented, and ironically, it was used by the state to elevate the status of women, but in local communities, it did the opposite. So whilst the state is eulogizing and actually using women as heroes of the struggle, of the combat, to be reflective of the ethnic identities, within the communities, that ostracism that was spoken of in the video beforehand was absolutely paramount and vicious in some of its manifestations. There were women who wanted to come forward and testify, and who would never then, whose husbands left them. We had at least one woman who was killed by her husband after he found that she had been raped. Social ostracism, especially for those who then had children as a result of the rapes, and we still don't know what really happened to many of those children. Some yes, some not. So extraordinarily difficult, and for women to come forward in those circumstances was difficult for the ICTY, but even more difficult when the prosecutions were then transferred to the local courts, because Bosnia is small, and the way in which it was done did not protect your identities. So extraordinarily difficult in terms of the social and cultural context in which these prosecutions were taking place because of the way it impacted on their personal lives. Now, that is crucial in understanding whether and how and in what way we can actually address sexual violence in armed conflict, because sexual violence in armed conflict works for that very reason. It is the crime that will divide communities completely. It is the crime which will make sure that some women are never able to feel part of those communities again. When we hear that women would have preferred to have died rather than to continue to live with the shame and stigma of the rape, then that shows the context in which they're having to live and continue to live their lives. Sorry, excuse me. So how do we shift that dynamic? How do we change that dynamic so that women can have their rightful place as real actors and purveyors in society? There's been a lot of work has gone into trying to study how to do this, but I want to just reflect a moment on the why. First, we have obviously got this major division, but how do we get there? How do we get there from peacetime into sexual violence in armed conflict, and what are the linkages? Just to say that when I was 20, I volunteered in the Rape Crisis Center, and one of the things that we did in the Rape Crisis Center, or we said we would do, is that we would accompany women to court. I never went. Not once did I go to court, because nobody that was in the Rape Crisis Center I was working at testified. And the reason for that was because of the social stigmas which flowed from going forward. That was a long time ago, but still in the United Kingdom, less than 9% of those who go to court who have been raped do go to court and are successful. 9%. And the reasons for that are because we're locked within a patriarchal system which is reflective of the views that consent is still an issue. Now, if we have that in non-conflict, and then we transfer that into conflict, we have a multiplier effect, which is extremely, extremely dangerous in terms of how we are to look at actually addressing it. In Bosnia, as I said, as was mentioned in the introduction, not only was there sexual violence in the conflict, but there was trafficking, massive trafficking. How did we get from the peacekeepers going there to protect civilians into a situation where they are the perpetrators of exactly the same sorts of crimes that they were brought into Bosnia to prevent happening again? And ironically, some of the traffickers almost reenacted the Kunarats case in how it was done. They held women in the same sort of houses, subjected them to the same sorts of treatment, allowed them to go out, but not very far, because they could obviously bring them back at will. A degree of freedom, a degree of courtship by some of the perpetrators, but never freedom. And the users clearly were the military, the international community, and the international police, more than others. Reflective of ordinary society, where you have militarization. Rape is a crime of power and violence. And when you have a militarized body going into a place where they enjoy a degree of immunity, they have this idea that they have power. True, they do. They have privilege, and therefore they have entitlement. Not every guy who went to Bosnia and served did commit these crimes. Of course not. But the astonishing thing is that nobody really spoke out about it either. The men who were part of the Band of Brothers stayed part of the Band of Brothers with this sort of pack mentality of sticking together over and above their obligations to adhere to international law. And I talked to many of them as to what was, why was this possible? How could this happen? And I said, one very good Norwegian commander said to me, never underestimate the power of cognitive dissonance. We believe we're nice guys, and we pay for it, so it's better if I do it than if anybody else does. And then the other thing is, of course, at the end of the day, they're just horse. So there was this attitude of good old-fashioned misogyny, if you like, of the role of women within societies and the privilege of the male perpetrator, which has then transformed itself into this idea of entitlement, absolutely endorsed and strengthened by the culture of the military. A lot of men who may have come forward and did actually give testimony to me, which I still have, but asked me, please do not use this, didn't like what they saw, but were afraid. Because if you spoke out, then you were ostracized by your battalion, by your unit, and you couldn't afford to do that in a place where that's all you had. So you don't speak out, you maintain the line, and you stick together. And that is as true for rape in conflict as it is for those who are practicing sexual exploitation and abuse after the conflict. So there are these similarities, there's these similar strands. The main one being, I would argue, in relation to men, is that of militarization. But before I mention that, I do want to talk a little bit about the male rape. And I should have brought this in earlier because it relates absolutely to prosecutions. Because we are now finding much more about male rape and sexualized violence against men, whether it be in detention centers, whether it be in conflict. And of course it's something that is now coming out as being something which is massive, but was just not reported about before. And the reason it was not reported about before is that men were not talking about it before. I did meet some guys in Bosnia who did say, well, they were part of the camp survivors, and at one of the meetings they did say, yes, they had been sexually violated in the camps. And we asked, well, what do you need? Who would you talk to? They said, we'd talk to other men. But that wasn't available for them at the time. Now I think that there are adjustments made that we are doing better. But what it does do is very interesting to see how this has happened, because in the tribunals for the former Yugoslavia, sexual violence against men was prosecuted. It was one of the first cases that was prosecuted, that of genital mutilation, which was particularly horrific. But sexual violence against men was always prosecuted as torture. And it was always a witness, not the survivor, who testified. But what it does do, and I think maybe this is going to be of greater significance legally and therefore socially in future, is that it shows sexual violence as a matter of power and of violence, not of sex. And there's no way ever that I think that a judge is going to ask about consent in the issue of the rape of a male, which is as it should be. Of course it's as it should be. We certainly don't want that being the consent being transferred towards men as well. What we want is the removal of this consensual element from the ways which is prosecuted by women. That would lead to much greater equality. It would reframe the discussion as to what sexual violence in armed conflict and rape actually are, and therefore bring greater equality, and I think over time would lead to the erosion of the stigma which is attached to the rape of women in conflict. I don't know that for sure. I just hope it's true. But I think there's definitely progress being made along those lines. So if we then go back to the male as the perpetrator, as part of this use of violence and power, how do we get there? There's always a question, how do we get there? And I think that one of these stirring factors from the experience I had in Bosnia, particularly in relation to the sexual exploitation and abuse and the testimonies of the women, was this concept of militarization. And this is where we are now, not just, I think worldwide now, we are in a highly militarized modum of operating. When Wolf started 100 years ago, two of their first diagnosis they wanted to do to stop the First World War was to look at root causes. And the thing that drew me to Wolf, I have to say, in the first place, was this incredible sentence they had as militarization as a way of thought. So all security comes from the barrel of a gun, essentially, with soldiers holding the guns in order to provide us with security. The other thing they put as root cause was inequalities between people and between nations. So the militarization and the inequalities go hand in hand. Our inequalities are protected by the militarization, or sustained by the militarization. And what do I mean by this? Essentially, patriarchy, and I think we can now throw in neoliberalism as another root cause. Patriarchy, neoliberalism needs and builds a particular form of masculinity. And that's a masculinity which is prepared to use violence in order to achieve certain goals. It also requires a particular femininity, and that would be the one that is supportive of the guy going to the front to fight. When I was in Ukraine fairly recently, the massive propaganda, as you can imagine, during a conflict. Images of the guy going off to the front. You know, he's always the big guy. He's always got a baby he's carrying that he gives back to his wife, and then he's surrounded by flowers, by women waving him off at the train station. 100 years of difference between that image from the First World War and now, but still the same construction of gender roles. But not only that now, because now the militarization process needs us. It wants all of us, not me, I'm too old now, but it needs young women to go and be active participants in the militarization process. And that's terrifying, because what it means is that we as feminists are supposed to support that. And if you're opposed to militarization in any shape or form, then that is not something that we could see as being the panacea for the fundamental changes that are needed. So in the process of constructing these violent masculinities, it also creates this band of brothers mentality. It also brings into play how we get to those gender roles in the first place. And enough now has been written about political economy and political economy of violence to help us understand how those constructions take place and why it is and how it is that we could undo the structures which lead to the militarization, which lead to the creation of violent masculinities. It was even recognized in the summit the UK held in London in 2014, where they actually said that, you know, engaging with men and actually putting money and financing into greater equality would lead to a reduction in sexual violence. Well, that's not half bad from a summit, and Secretary of State Kerry, he was one of the main protagonists of such a line of argument. And it works like this. Because within a family, it starts within the family, political economy within the family. Who has power, who uses that power, how they use it, and what they do as a result of that. So in the family, if there's inequality within the family, if the woman is seen as subordinate to the male members of the family, she's not going to be able to access her human rights. So the chances of her then accessing those rights in the labour market is then reflected. The labour market reflects the power dynamics within the family. The labour market is then reflected in the governance structures. The governance structures then feed back into the creation of the traditionalized family and the traditional roles of men and women. It feeds into militarization. Militarization then feeds into the creation of violent masculinities, and we are on this roller coaster, circular moving vehicle that is not broken. What we have to do is go back to what it said at the summit and to invest in this. Because that's the other thing about militarization. It eats our resources. What we had in 2014 and rehearsed again last year, probably going to be even more this year, is an expenditure of 1.7 trillion on weapons, which is an awful, so many noughts I can't even begin to think about it, 1 year. In the meantime, the other partner in crime, this now neoliberalism, has allowed for $7.6 trillion to sit in offshore tax havens. Now, with all of that money together, you can do a lot. Just the arms budget itself would have led to the realization of all of the Millennium Development Goals. All of them. Eradicating world poverty, extreme poverty, world hunger, access to healthcare, access to education for every single child in the world. It's phenomenal. And we know that when we're addressing political economy and the creation of violent masculinities within political economy, one of the first things we must do is educate. So the resources are all there, but instead of doing that, we chose to do the other. We chose and continue to choose to invest in securitized military solutions. And after the bombing this morning in Belgium, so many leaders now said we're at war, which makes us afraid. And when we're afraid, we go back to our default positions and we look to the men with the guns in the subways to protect us from other men with guns who may turn up at some point. So this choice is huge and important in the whole range of issues that we've been talking about, but in particular in positioning us for future conflict. Because if we don't address political economy, if we don't address inequalities, then what we end up with doing is institutionalizing and building towards the militarization process. And the militarization process needs us to be afraid of, to fear others, in order for us to support them. Because when it comes to the final conclusions, it is not about them doing it on their own. There's a choice to be made. If you want to stop sexual violence and armed conflict, the only way you can do it is by not having the armed conflict. Laima Barry was absolutely right when she basically blew us out of the room in her speech to the summit in London by saying the premise is misconceived. Because conflict is all about using violence based on power to solve a dispute. Rape is about using violence and power. One feeds off the other. So if we do want to end sexual violence and armed conflict, the only thing to do is follow the other choice. And that other choice is to refuse to be co-opted into militarization, to refuse to let conflict be solved through violence, to use the other systems in place, the abilities that we have to solve conflict in a non-violent way. If we did that, then the question posed at the beginning, is it inevitable or constructed, is redundant. Questions? Thank you.
So we'll move into the Q&A, and of course Madeline can field her own questions. I just want to remind everyone that we are on the record and that we're making a video of the Q&A as well as the speech. So please bear that in mind when you ask your question. And if you could identify yourself also, that would be very helpful. So please.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Jim Dingman. I'm from Pacifica Radio. I want to get to this question of militarization because, of course, you're right. The machismo of a combat unit going into war and the band of brothers mentality, but the militarization of that, the machismo of that, is what leads to these incidents. And I want to get your opinion, and you're right, of course, the nonviolent approach is the solution to this, but in lieu of that, what do you see that has been in the uniformed militaries around the world in terms of dealing with this in some sort of realistic fashion? Because I talk to people who've just come back from Iraq and Afghanistan. They've seen things that are war crimes, and yet they would not reveal them because they would be killed by their brothers, and they're in combat with their brothers, so they have to rely on them to save their lives. So how do you deal with that kind of reality in this kind of situation now, with wars going on as we speak around the world?
That's a great question. Command responsibility. I think that's the simplest answer that I can give you, because in fact, of course, I was always found it incredible that the militaries refused to do and take any sort of action against soldiers who had committed crimes in the Bosnian context, in context of trafficking, because militaries are disciplined entities. You can be locked up in the British Army for not having shiny shoes.
Right.
So how can you not be locked up for committing crimes of sexual violence and other crimes? So it comes down to command responsibility, which is also an obligation, because basically if you don't do anything, you're the commander, it's you that should be actually saddled with the responsibility. I thought it was just a sidebar. I thought it was quite amusing when Ban Ki-moon declared himself the commander-in-chief of all the blue helmets when he was overexcited at the launch of the global study. Because I thought, aha, okay, if you're the commander-in-chief and they're committing these crimes, we know who to prosecute, don't we? I don't think he meant it that way. But that's the legal approach that should be taken. It's command responsibility. There must be laws in process. There is the duty of inquiry as well. It's not just a passive, it's an active obligation. So that if, for example, you have a series of say, Congo, particular case in point, where troops were going in and they were burning villages and they were committing atrocities against the domicile population, probably and including rape, even if not investigated, very likely. Jurisprudence has actually said you're allowed to think that there is likely to be rape. What's the obligation on the commander-in-chief? He has to make it absolutely clear before they go into the village, before they even start, that what is off limits, what you're not allowed to do. And then if there are allegations made afterwards, he has to investigate who is responsible for it and then ensure that there is effective punishment and redress after. Doesn't happen. Because basically, if he did do that, he gets off, but he has to prosecute the guys. They should be the ones to be locked up. If he doesn't do that, then he's the one holding the can. So you should be able to win one or the other, but we're not doing it. And this is the lack of political will in holding state, or not just the state apparatus particularly, but also non-state actors accountable. There are rules, there are laws. It's not done, it must be done. There is now supposedly going to be a much tighter procedure in place for sexual exploitation abuse within peacekeeping forces, not necessarily for United Nations staff, but for peacekeeping forces. But even that was strongly opposed by certain troop-contributing countries who did not want there to be any sort of naming, shaming, investigations attaching to the country themselves. So it's a huge problem, and it's political will. It's absolutely political will, because the law is there, the processes are there, it is just the failure to do it. And I think what you just said about the need to rely on your band of brothers in those situations is the biggest problem there is, and biggest inhibitor there is. So much work to be done in that field. A lot of it as well about responsibility. You know, each individual soldier having responsibility. One guy from the Norwegian battalion in Kosovo, he actually said it starts with me. If I show leadership and I say that I would not touch a woman in any negative way, and I revere women, and I do that, then they are my subordinates. They have to do that too. But I have to live it. I have to show by leadership. So there's a lot of different elements within it, carrot, stick, and regulation and punishment. But it's going to take a long time, because war is so vicious and so difficult, I think, for people to actually carve out a space for humanity inside, that once gloves are off, and another guy told me that once you've done it once, it's the second time's dead easy. Whether it be killing, whether it be sexual violence. So there's a problem.
Question?
Hi, my name is Christina. You mentioned at the end of your speech that the question of inevitability or the constructed nature of sexual violence is not really a question from what you gathered from your speech, but you also mentioned how sexual violence is a sort of tied into armed conflict in general. So once you get rid of armed conflict, you get rid of sexual violence. But couldn't you argue that, say, armed conflict is inevitable, considering all of the historical implications we have by this point, and so sexual violence per se is also inevitable?
Well, if that's true, then I have to give up my job. Because I don't believe that's true. I actually do think that we have, if it's a long project, it's a very long project, because if we're going to start with this whole concept of political economy and equalities within that, we have to invest in it. It doesn't change overnight. Men are brought up to be a particular way. Women are brought up to be a particular way. We're getting much, much better at it, because it doesn't suit anyone. As an organization, we are now working very closely with Men Engage, who are a coalition of men's organizations who really want to address the creation of violent masculinities and gender-based violence in particular. And they do great work. And the irony of it is, there are more like them than there are of the others. And in fact, even they did a survey in DRC, and 60% of the guys interviewed actually believed that there were two types of rape. They thought one rape was not so bad because you didn't injure the woman. But then there were the bad rapes, the ones with the mutilations, and they all said, well, 60%, absolutely not to the bad rapes. Even more said no to the ordinary rapes. And that's in DRC. So with those sorts of numbers, then why is it that we're not getting a men's movement to stand up and say, we don't do this? So that in fact perpetrators become the ones who are ostracized rather than the woman who is the survivor. So I think, in answer to your question, if we put the resources into ending those inequalities, ending the gender stereotypical roles that are played, ending the need for the man to exert power in order to have status in society, end that, and then end the sorts of spending that we're putting into the militarization project, and put it into those other things I was talking about: education, healthcare, provision of food, ecological development, all the things that we need, then we would see a change. But it needs political will, and right now we don't have that sort of leadership to get us anywhere near that.
I think you have the first there.
Oh,
I just wanted to come on up, Velma, behind me. This is not about conflict. I'm going to ask you a question, Madeline, or actually propose to you a situation. If you look at the United States today, the Centers for Disease Control has documented that there's an epidemic level of sexual violence, intimate partner sexual violence in America. Add into that in the Western developed world, the United States has the lowest economic inequality of women in the developed Western world in terms of average pay and compensation for labor. And another factor is, in the Western developed world, U.S. women have the lowest political elected representation. So it does not come as any surprise to me that we have a problem with rape in America. And we have a problem on campus, on university campuses, and we have a problem of women in the military being raped by their fellow soldiers. So we have this problem that you, I think, have elucidated and articulated quite well. And now we are confronted with a person who's leading the Republican competition right now for president, who is a distillation, I think, and a representation of what actually exists in the United States that produces the data that I've laid out to you. So it is, I think it's an ominous moment. It isn't conflict, but it sure feels like it. And it feels like it online, wherever women are, and we have seen a spike too on violence against women in journalism, online, things that have been happening in the region, in the Balkans. It's happening all over the world. Dunya Miratovich has talked about this. So it's not armed conflict, but it certainly is conflict. And I just like, you're a UK citizen, you live outside of the United States. I'd like to hear just your observations on it based upon social science and indeed law, as a matter of fact.
That's a 4-hour conversation, Tanya, at least. No, I think what you've just described is, in fact, the scenarios which lead to conflict. I mean, looking at the structure, the inequalities in the structures within the United States, as an observer, they really are quite striking and more than worrying, because it creates an environment in which violence is seen as being something which is almost normal. And when you have someone like Trump, who is prepared to use violence in the way he speaks, violence in the way he presents, and to be the epitome of everything you don't want in a man, then I think you do actually lead to this bifurcation within societies. And it is dangerous, because it is true. I think even in the Balkans Wars, more women were raped in the United States during the period of the Balkans Wars than were actually raped in Bosnia, which is a horrifying statistic when you think of it. Of course it is. And how many were prosecuted? So it's changing the nature of the way of thought as to how you look at economic structures which are highly discriminatory, as you mentioned, and then political structures which are reflective of that, and reflective of a system. And I think there's the problem, one of the major problems is structural. That when you have a system which is based and entrenched so much on a theory of economic exchange, as this one is, then it is very difficult then to shift that narrative into one where anybody who talks about equality in terms of economic distribution is labeled a communist, a socialist, and therefore anti-American. It absolutely is you are the Antichrist if you take those sorts of positions in America. There's no space for that debate even. And yet I bet you most people in the United States would like to have that discussion a little bit more in order to achieve the sorts of equalities that are needed to end the violence that is being perpetrated in various forms, either on the internet or physically, within marriage, within relationships, or otherwise. But it's a massive conversation, and I'm not seeing it being held in the election process at the moment. Probably doesn't answer your question completely, but I think it is symptomatic. It's very symptomatic. And you watch your countries catapulting towards violent conflict, then you have exactly where you are.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Velma Šarić, and I'm coming from Bosnia. So first of all, I have to say thank you for everything what you have done for my country. And I know that you have been involved in the special initiative for preventing sexual violence in conflict. You mentioned Summit of 2014. And I know that there is this incredible document, which is a set of great recommendations and guidelines how to document sexual violence in conflict. And having in mind what is going on now in Syria and the Middle East, I think that this document will actually be a main tool to document all these horrific crimes. I would like to know more. I know we did a lot of, I was helping to launch this protocol in Bosnia together with the British Embassy. And in 2012, we worked together with Angelina Jolie to help her to release her plot. So I would like to know, I know we did a lot of education of judges and prosecutors, how to approach the witnesses. I know we did a lot of education also of soldiers and a lot of trainings, but I would like to know what is the future of initiative and is there anything else going on? Because I think that it's amazing what you did in London to bring 100 ministers of foreign affairs who, 150 years ago didn't even leave their own countries. I congratulate the British government. What British Prime Minister William Hague did is incredible because it really did break the stigma and silence related to victims of rape in my country. So thank you.
I think the protocol is extremely good. It's being revised now. It's being updated, and there's a few of us who are working on that. But I think the due credit to William Hague for doing what he did. A lot of us said that we thought that it was misconceived to say preventing sexual violence and armed conflict, as I said. But I think that what's happening now is updating of the protocol, but they're relocating PSVI within a broader context, which has happened now with the reorganization of the government and standing down of William Hague. And they're doing it more in a women, peace and security agenda, which is where it belongs. Because it's great to take it out and examine it and actually have real ways of addressing and readdressing it. But at the same time, you shouldn't have it as the only entry point, because one of the things that came out very strongly for me during the work in Bosnia was, so many women said, yes, I was raped, but it wasn't the worst thing that happened to me. And that was very true in many of the cases in Rwanda as well. It's not the worst thing that happened because there were so many horrors perpetrated, especially when it comes to killing your children in front of you, that sort of thing, that it wasn't, so it shouldn't be elevated, it shouldn't be given special status in a way that actually compounds the stigma attached to it. And I think that did happen in Bosnia, and the PSVI, with its best intentions, we were trying very hard not to let that happen. So to put it back, unpack it, put it back in its box of horrors, tortures that happen during conflict, and then address them in a way which is socially and culturally relevant. I should have mentioned during the talk, because I think this is very important, what happened in Bosnia after the ending of the conflict, where there was no real transition. There still has not been a real transition. There was no real reparations payments. The payments were made through the social welfare system. Women had to, for those who don't know, women had to be adjudicated, the extent of their injury had to be adjudicated against the military code, which was, if you've lost a leg, you get so much, if you've lost an eye, you've got so much. And of course you can't do that with rape, it doesn't work. But cases were brought, appeals were made to say we are entitled to a pension, and pensions were paid, but within the social welfare system. And that meant Enterstage left the IMF, and there you are, you have conditionalities, and guess who the first lot to lose their pensions in terms of any meaningful amounts? It was women who'd been raped. And because the pensions of the veterans was ring-fenced and protected. So every single time the IMF came back, there was less and less and less money. So a shrinking pension and no reparation at all, nothing. And we're still now advocating there should be a real reparation set up, a proper adjudicated one for all civilian victims of war. But not only were they in this terrible situation of just a tiny, tiny pension, they have been put in competition with other survivors because there's no money for any reparation for anyone. So you've now got a massive division. You've got the survivors of sexual violence, you've got the camp survivors, you've got the families of the missing, you name torture victims, and they're all positioning themselves to try to get what little tiny bits of money are being handed out to them by the nationalist parties who are manipulating them. And what you found with women is that the INGOs particularly have gone and providing counselling and services. Excellent, it's all needed. But not forever and ever and ever, because what we've ended up with instead is women who have an identity only as a victim. She doesn't exist outside that victimhood. And what we've done then is we've perpetuated and reinforced the social stigma that was done in the first place in order to create that stigma so as to destroy communities. So we've got to be so careful how we do it. And I think with the PSVI, great that we have the protocol. I think that is used. We're using it with the Syrians now. But the other thing we have to learn is all those lessons from Bosnia, to put that into the mix, that any approach to sexual violence is an entry point only, and the entry point to understanding how better to unpack and address social economic rights, predominantly. Just to say, when I first went to Bosnia, it was at the invitation of Medica Zenica. It was Medica Mondial at the time. And they wanted me to come and explain, so end of 95, beginning 96, they wanted me to go and explain the ICTY, because no one really explained how the ICTY worked, what it meant. And one of the very obvious things was very few women were coming forward. They were giving statements, but they weren't then going forward. And so why not? And the very obvious things that came to us, all of us at the same time, was that when they have no knowledge of where their partner may be, so you've got somebody missing, when you don't know where you're going to live, how you're going to feed your kids, how you're going to access healthcare, you don't know where to register for your documentation, you're too busy to think of testifying as to what happened to you, the person. You might do in 5 years, 10 years, when everything is put back in place. So what we've been trying with PSVI is to say, you've got to do joined up thinking, you've got to create an enabling environment where it's possible for women to come forward and testify. And then, with the documentation that's done, we can actually get some form of both reparation, but also of restorative justice. There's a whole, we're trying that with some of the Syrians now. We are actually working with them on doing just that and using the documentation in the way that came out from the protocol. But there's a lot of work to be done, and unfortunately, much as the PSVI initiative is great and all that sort of thing, the best thing the British could actually do would be to stop the massive arms sales that they perpetrate in $6 billion of equipment to the Saudi Arabian government, which they are using to rain chaos on Yemen and in Syria and elsewhere where rape and sexual violence are absolutely rampant. It's not joined up thinking. The Chancellor is not talking to the people who want to stop sexual violence. So I think it's there are these we need to take the political perspective as well as the human rights one when we're talking about the initiatives like the campaign.
If I could ask you one last question, and drawing on your experience as just an agent for change and transformation in so many different international networks across different issues, I wonder if you could speak to a little bit how you think strategically about global normative campaigns, from your various positions. What are the most essential steps in any campaign of changing mindsets, changing the sort of matter-of-factness, right, that we take things, and has that evolved over the last few years? Is it harder now or easier now? Does social media and the spotlight, does it have a greater effect than it used to in the past, or are we all sort of not attuned to all these messages going on? Because you've really been involved in so many different networks and organizations. We'd love to hear your perspective on this.
That's a difficult question to answer, because I could answer, my instinct was, oh, it's much easier now. And then I was thinking about it, actually, no, it's not. So it's a balance between those two positions, I think. Issues like the prosecution of sexual violence and armed conflict was not easy, but there was a sustained campaign. And it was fueled by the amazing women from Bosnia and Rwanda who came forward and testified, with a lovely, wonderful coalition of feminist lawyers, as I mentioned. That was really important. And I think as well the world had been shocked by the sheer extent of the sexualized violence in the Balkans, and so was looking for there to be some sort of redress. the attention span of the world is not great. That's the other part of it. So who knows that the Karadzic decision is going to come out this week? Probably you all do because you're engaged and interested, but for the rest of the people, the world's like, oh, so what? That was a long time ago, it's finished, isn't it? So that sustained thinking is necessary, and you've got to have a strategy, and you've got to have a plan as to where and how to pick things off. And it's fascinating to me always, in terms of jurisprudential development, is it's like, you pick your area and then you stretch the membrane thin so you can go through it. We have a strategy on getting militarization and arms into reports to CEDAW and getting the CEDAW committee to actually confirm in their concluding comments what we are saying. And we've done it. Yeah, we actually look to countries like Spain, like Sweden, who have massive arms exports and are definitely trying to sell arms in countries where perhaps they shouldn't be. And we've got good concluding observations. So there's beginnings of normative frameworks like that, but it's a little bit under the radar screen, so it's not one of the big campaigns. But think of, how many of you know that there is actually an attempt now to have a transnational corporation convention? What a great idea that is. Because if there is, it will regulate, it will hit on just about everything that can be problematic to states. It would regulate who and in what companies can go in where. It will regulate the standards of labor that they actually have in countries. It will regulate the levels of pay. It will regulate, basically bring the ILO standards into multinational corporations. It will regulate the trade. It will provide protection. It's got great ideas. But nobody's in there fighting for it. Civil society is not in there fighting for it because they don't know about it. And yet it is probably the one new convention that could happen after we've had all the other human rights ones, the one which will actually create a fundamental difference. And it would really drive, with that legal expression of coach and horses, through the neoliberal project. Because it would give power back to people and to trade unions and. And you can imagine what we could do with it from a gender perspective. And I'm really excited by it, as you can tell. But it's got nobody really backing for it. South Africa's having a little bit of a go. Cuba's the sponsoring nation. Ecuador, fabulous, taking the lead on it. A few Latin Americans dithering on the outside. And then us as civil society coming in to try and give the support. But, the United States and the European Union, not really interested. But if we all engaged, it would happen. But the problem with social media is it gives, or tweeting, 2 minutes you think you've done it. I'll sign that petition, boom, gone. And then I'm back to reading something completely different. So that's the problem I think we have, is getting the attention of people who then stay in that movement to actually affect the change. Because this is going to take 5 years or more to negotiate and to push. And I bet you there aren't that many people who are going to be that engaged for that amount of time with everything else that's going on, and that is our problem.
Super. Well, thank you so much for your insights, your perspectives, and I invite everyone to thank Madeline and also to reconvene tomorrow for the rest of our conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.